Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. So you think you know Benedict Arnold, our country's biggest traitor, right? Well, yeah, he was a traitor, and he's pretty much our most famous one. But in the formative years of this country, he was also one of its best military leaders, in fact, maybe even the best. So what went wrong? Why did he become a traitor? Well, wait until you hear the story from our guest today, Regan Miner. She's the executive director of the Norwich Historical Society, and that's the city where Arnold was born and raised. And you simply have to hear his backstory. Now, it doesn't change what he did, but it does help explain perhaps some of the inner demons that led him in that direction. Regan will be along in a moment with this very captivating story. This week's trivia question: this Connecticut man made one of the most chilling discoveries of the past 250 years. Who was he, and what did he discover? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. There's an old saying that a bad person doesn't start off life that way, and nowhere might that be more true than in the case of Benedict Arnold. Now, if you don't know the full story of Arnold's upbringing, you may be in for a bit of a surprise. When you stop to think, he was a top colonial military general, and he ended up turning coat and defecting to the British. You just know there has to be more to the story, and indeed there is. Our guest today has that backstory, and it's fascinating. Regan Miner is the executive director of the Norwich Historical Society. That's the city where Arnold was born and raised. Regan, I think all of us, when we get on in life, can look back and say, gee, what happened in our childhood that kind of shaped our lives? What kind of influences were there? And, you know, when you talk about Benedict Arnold, I think that's kind of an important question, because here he was, one of America's best generals during the Revolutionary War. He was a confidant to George Washington, who thought very highly of him. And he goes all the way from that to a traitor. And, you know, a lot's been made of that, and we'll get into that. But let's start when he was young. When he was born in 1741 in Norwich, he came into a pretty good start in terms of a pretty influential family with his ancestors in Rhode Island, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so Benedict Arnold was born here in Norwich on January 14th in 1741. And what's kind of interesting is he wasn't the first to have the name Benedict Arnold. He was actually the fifth one to claim that name. He did have an older brother who was also named Benedict Arnold, but that brother died in infancy. So technically, the Benedict Arnold that we know today is, the fifth Benedict Arnold. I refer to his father as Captain Benedict Arnold to help differentiate between the two Arnolds. It must drive genealogists crazy when all the colonists name their children after their fathers and grandfathers and vice versa. So to keep track of everything, I refer to Arnold's father as Captain Benedict Arnold. So Captain Arnold was originally from Rhode Island, and he moved to Norwich with his other brother Oliver to, try to make a name for themselves in the community. The Arnolds really hail from a long Rhode Island lineage. Interestingly enough, Captain Arnold, so Benedict Arnold's great-grandfather, Captain Arnold's grandfather, was the governor of Rhode Island, which is pretty interesting. And also on his mother's side, he had some prominent family lineage as well with the Waterman and Lathrop family of Norwich, and they were part of the original English settlement to come to Norwich in 1659. So on both sides of his parents' lineage, he's got some high-profile relatives, which is pretty interesting.
So he starts off life with not necessarily a silver spoon, but certainly a pretty good start. And his dad wants to get him to Yale, so he sends him to this pretty prestigious boarding school in Canterbury. And he goes there, and while he's away, I guess some very tragic illness hits the family.
Yeah, like you just mentioned, the Arnold family was pretty respectable, pretty well off, and it was expected that young Benedict would go to Yale and further his studies, as all boys from respectable families did at the time. And yes, while he was away, there was some really unfortunate events that happened to the town, but also to the family. So I mentioned Captain Arnold. He was a merchant, and he had a lot of different town positions in Norwich. But unfortunately, there was a lot of conflict in the community. In Norwich itself, in 1745, there was a separatist revolt which really divided Norwich, including some of Benedict's extended family. There was a lot of differing religious beliefs, and the church split, which caused a lot of tensions in the community. And then, of course, more nationally, Britain and France were at war. And during these conflicts with these international powers, Captain Arnold really overextended his mercantile business, which really would have some dire consequences for the family in later years. And while Benedict was at school, unfortunately, the family was hit with some really tragic circumstances, one after the other. The first was in about 1750, when one of Benedict's younger brothers, Absalom, died from a disease. And then in 1753, his two younger sisters, they died about 19 days apart from each other. So at this point, there was only one sibling, Hannah, who was at home, and she was the only one, aside from Benedict, to survive to adulthood. So this was really a quite challenging time for the family with losing all these children.
And even in those time frames where medicine wasn't what it is today, it wasn't unusual to lose a family member or even a couple, but this really had a devastating effect on the family. And the father, with his overextension, as you say, of his mercantile business, really turned to alcohol, didn't he?
Yeah, and I think you have a good point, because death was a part of life back in this time period. I mean, you go into a colonial burying ground, and you see multiple grave after grave for young children who die young. Based off of the records that I read about the Arnold family, it just sounds like the parents and the children were a really close-knit family, and I think the loss of the kids just was devastating to them. And during this time, with Captain Arnold's business not being able to function well, he turned to alcohol to numb the pain of his family's ruined finances, but also the loss of the children. And it really brought a mark of shame onto the Arnold family. And again, I mentioned that they were, well respected in the community, but because of Captain Arnold's alcoholism, their status in the community fell. They had hoped that maybe the community would have supported them during this challenging time in their family's life, but in fact, the total opposite happened. Captain Arnold kind of became a pariah, so to speak, and he was arrested multiple times for public intoxication. There's other records that show that young Benedict Arnold had to haul his father out of one of the local taverns. One of the ways that really shows the family's fallen finances and also status is they used to have a pew that they paid for in the church. And interestingly enough, Benedict Arnold's mother, Hannah Arnold, is very pious. She was very religious. Going to church was something that was very important to her. And as the family kind of fell into further ruin, they got pushed further and further back in the church, because the closest you were to the front of the church, closer to the pastor, was your indication of you're closest to God, so therefore you're a little more wealthy and can afford that sort of seat. But they kept getting further and further pushed back in the church until eventually they were resigned to the gallery for the poor people in the upper wings of the church, which was just literally every week a public humiliation for Hannah Arnold to show how far they have come and how far they have fallen in the community. So it was not a great time for them at all.
I don't at all want to be an apologist for what Benedict Arnold did in his military career and later in life. But when you stop and think about what he must have, felt like at that point in his life, coming from a heralded family to, really a downtrodden family, it really must have played on his mind. And then at age 18, his mother, the only stable one adult in the family at that point, passed away.
Yeah, exactly, yes. It's really quite a tragic story when you really think about it. He was orphaned by the age of about 20, 21. Every future he had been hoping for and promised didn't really come to fruition, because with his father out of work and, not earning an income, the family could no longer pay for Arnold's private schooling. So he had to drop out of school, and also there went any hopes of him going to Yale. and he wasn't able to learn the family business from his father because of his ill health. So Hannah Arnold, his mother, asked her cousins, the Lathrop brothers, if they could engage young Arnold as an apprentice. And the Lathrop brothers were apothecaries, or what we would probably refer to as pharmacists today. And interestingly enough, they were the only pharmacist or apothecary in Connecticut at the time. So they had really a really well-run business at this point. They were conveniently located in Norwich, which was halfway between Boston and New York, so they got a lot of traffic that way. So the Lathrop brothers made Arnold their junior business associate, and they helped set him up in New Haven to start his own business later on in life. And what's great about the Lathrop brothers is they really cared for Arnold and his surviving sister, Hannah. While he was an apprentice with them, he learned how to be a mariner, he learned how to run his own business, and he really became a self-starter based upon his apprenticeship. And so once he fulfilled his obligations as an apprentice, the Lathrop brothers helped set him up with his own business in New Haven so he could try to launch himself into his new career that way.
And I think you just laid out a perfect argument for the fact that Benedict Arnold was no slouch. I mean, he was brilliant. He was just a tremendous military general on the battlefield. And in business, he did very well. So this, again, he knew he had talent. He knew he had skills. But as you very well put it, everything he had been promised did not come to him. And I think this comes back later in life as a theme. Now, he was married twice, both times to women named Margaret, actually, which is kind of ironic. But the first one was Margaret Mansfield. Tell me about this. Did he get married to her before their family sort of hit the downturn? Because she came from a pretty prominent family as well, if I understand it right.
Yeah, so that's a great question. You had alluded earlier that Hannah Arnold, his mother, died in 1759, and so then shortly thereafter, his father finally passed away in 1761. He essentially drank himself to death. And I like to think that there was probably some relief a little bit when his father passed away, that his suffering has ended, but also the constant shame on the family name has at this point ended too. And so it was just Benedict and his younger sister Hannah left. They left Norwich in 1761, and to my knowledge, they didn't come back. They left the town behind, the town that really didn't help support the family during their times of need, with the sole exception of the Lathrop brothers helping the two siblings. So they moved on to New Haven, and that's where Benedict Arnold established his business as a merchant and bookseller, and where he met Margaret Mansfield. She was, interestingly enough, the daughter of Samuel Mansfield, who was the local sheriff, and he was also a member of the Masonic Lodge. So that got Arnold in with the quote-unquote good old boys in New Haven. It really helped elevate his status in the community at that point. I always say when I do walking tours that I think Benedict had a chip on his shoulder really for his whole life, because he always felt like he needed to prove himself because of his upbringing, because of the constant shame that his father brought to his family name. He always felt the need to, rise above that and restore honor to his family name. So everything that he did in New Haven to build up his business and build up his family, marry into a wealthy New Haven family was one of those ways that he was trying to do that. So they married 5 or so years after he moved to New Haven and established his business. So he was really working hard during this time to really make a name for himself in New Haven.
Now, this is not at all an episode about his military conquest, so I'm just going to quickly rattle off a couple of the big ones. He was right there for the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, but like you said, with his chip on his shoulder and whatnot, he gets into an argument with Ethan Allen over who actually going to run this now. He almost pulls off a takeover of Quebec and the annexing of Canada, but that didn't quite work out. But he did have a pretty good showing at the Battle of Ridgefield, and certainly at Saratoga, the victory there, which is what convinced France to come into the war. And George Washington loved this guy. I mean, he twice delayed the British in, one at Saratoga and then stopping their advance on Lake Champlain. He was just brilliant in that respect. But he also suffered a debilitating leg wound, twice wounded, and finally to the point where they had to, I guess, instead of amputate it, they set it, but it made his left leg shorter than his right by about 2 inches, and his wife died while he was fighting at Ticonderoga. So all of this now, he's, depressed, And Washington sets him up with a position that in hindsight may not have been the best one, but he made him military governor of Philadelphia. And let's talk about what happened there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there when he was in Philadelphia. But yeah, I think following his injury for the, like you said, in the same leg for the second time at Saratoga, Arnold was a very physical person. He was jumping off horses. He was charging into battle. I mean, he was this very physical guy. And since his leg injury was set incorrectly, like you mentioned, he kind of became a cripple, and he couldn't do some of these same physical things that he was normally able to do. And I think that also really demoralized his spirits. He was a guy that was kind of hot-headed, quick to react and quick to act. And I think sitting around just ruminating on all of his wrongs that have been done to him throughout the course of his life was probably not the best thing to have happened, frankly, after this point in time. So, and it's interesting, is the Battle of Saratoga really cemented his status as America's greatest fighting general, but he wasn't able to continue with that following his leg injury. And so he was convalescing for about 7 months or so before finally taking command of Philadelphia. And it was kind of a real disastrous decision on George Washington's part to appoint Arnold in this role, because Arnold was never one to do well with politics, and he didn't really have really good diplomatic skills, which really made him many enemies early on in his career. He did not fit into the good old boys club of the Continental Army and Congress, and now he was in charge of Philadelphia as their military governor following British withdrawal. So this job really highlighted all of Arnold's weaknesses, which ultimately brought him to his ruin, because he immediately clashed with the Pennsylvania Supreme Executive Council, which was headed by Joseph Reed, who was a pretty radical guy. He used to be aide-de-camp to General Washington, and the Executive Council really wanted revenge after the British Army left Philadelphia. And Arnold's mandate was that he needed to keep the peace, yet the Executive Council just wanted to pursue their own agenda and targeting any remaining loyalists and any of those who were left in the city who thought they were suspected of treason. And this has caused real friction between Arnold and the Executive Council. So Arnold was really put in a hard position to manage this Executive Council and trying to keep the peace. And because of that, the detractors just kept adding on and giving him more negative publicity, because he wasn't able to really handle the situation. He was not diplomatic, so he did not really do well with managing all of these issues here. There's a whole bunch of other issues about the Executive Council accusing him of profiting off his position. So there's a whole lot of backstory there as well. Eventually, Arnold just was like, fine, if you're accusing me of these things that are not true, why don't you just court-martial me then? And then I can have the opportunity to defend myself. It was a really tumultuous time with Arnold in Philadelphia. And it was at this point where he met his second wife, Peggy Shippen, who was born a prominent local judge, and the family was well known to have loyalist tendencies. They were a very prominent Philadelphia family. And it was Peggy Shippen who ultimately introduced Benedict Arnold to Major John Andre, who would ultimately help him craft the treasonous plot where Benedict Arnold would give up plans to Fort West Point to the British.
Now, the other thing that happened there with this court-martial that was interesting, because it got delayed because of, battle issues and whatnot, and it stretched on for about a month, the actual court-martial proceedings. And at the end, he was convicted, but not a serious conviction, not a serious charge. He was called imprudent and improper, his conduct, and got the mildest punishment possible, I guess a reprimand that George Washington had to issue. But even that was enough to blow the top off of Benedict Arnold, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. He really thought of Washington as almost like a pseudo-father figure, and then to get a slap on the wrist from him was just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Arnold had even said to Washington in a letter during this court-martial, he said, quote, having made every sacrifice of fortune and blood, and become a cripple in the service of my country. I little expected to meet the ungrateful returns I have received from my countrymen, end quote. So that just really shows you how disillusioned and frustrated Arnold is by this whole situation.
Exactly. And, of course, we know what happened. He is assigned then by Washington to run West Point. He lies to Washington and tells him, yeah, everything's great, we're in good shape. Meanwhile, he's making steps to hand over West Point to the British. That all gets unmasked and uncovered, and Washington actually orders him executed if they can capture him. And I think this is sort of like the ironic end of this whole drama. It's like a Greek tragedy that then Benedict Arnold would come back not too far from Norwich to New London and Groton, and the last British victory of the war he led as those two cities got torched. It was a slaughter, and it was a particularly heinous, even for military terms, kind of event. Was this him getting revenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting that I would have put victory in air quotes about the battles of New London and Groton Heights, and then ultimately he went down to Richmond and burned Richmond as well. I don't know if I see this necessarily as revenge. I think it's quite possible that Arnold would have known people in Groton and New London, with Norwich being just up the river. I feel like I read a reference saying that he was dining in an old friend's house in New London while the battle was raging. And I don't think Arnold intended for the battle to get as bloody at Groton Heights as it did. My understanding is that he had told the commanding officer of the troops in Groton not to go crazy, like, let's leave some prisoners, let's not go crazy. And he didn't necessarily want to burn the entire city of New London. He was just targeting the military targets of the city. But then, of course, one thing snowballed to the next, and then the whole town was alight before he knew it. And by the time a rower rowed across the river to try to give a message to the other commanding officer at Groton Heights, that battle had already dissolved into a massacre.
And then the upshot of the whole thing is the British never end up really rewarding him at all either. So he doesn't get the command he was looking for on the U.S. side. The British kind of shun him afterwards, and he ends up dying in London penniless. So here's just a tragic figure from beginning to end. Started off in pretty good shape, in life, and then it just all seemed to go downhill for him in so many different ways. Knowing all that you know, Regan, is he judged too harshly as only a traitor given his circumstances?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, and it's interesting that you said he didn't really receive the full benefits that he expected from the British Army. I mean, he was mistrusted and seen as a failed spy from the British. Even though he was commanding troops, the troops didn't really trust him. He kind of became a man without a country, and he tried to start his mercantile business again in Canada and then London, but was really unsuccessful both times. And then his health really started to decline, and he died in London in 1801. And there are some records that say that when Arnold was laying on his deathbed, he said, and I'll quote, "Let me die in this old uniform in which I fought my battles. May God forgive me for ever having put on another," end quote, in reference to his, Continental Army uniform. So I think there's a little bit of remorse. It's interesting because whenever someone says the name Benedict Arnold, his name is synonymous with the word traitor. But it's also interesting to note that he wasn't necessarily only traitor during the Revolutionary War. He just happens to be the most notorious and most prominent because he was so well known during his lifetime, and he was one of Washington's trusted generals. If Arnold had died at Saratoga instead of being wounded, he would have been hailed as the greatest military hero of American history as opposed to its most evil villain.
And as a footnote, I think it's important to note that the victory that Arnold secured at Saratoga had been watched pretty closely by the French. When they saw the outcome, they decided to commit their own troops to the cause, and that's when Rochambeau and his 5,000 troops came into play. That's just how important that Battle of Saratoga was to the War of Independence. Now, at that Saratoga battleground in New York State, there's a monument that simply displays a boot. Now, make no mistake about it, the monument's actually in honor of Benedict Arnold, but those who crafted it had to be careful not to mention his name due to his traitorous legacy. However, the inscription on that monument reads in such a way that Had history been just a little bit different, as Regan suggested, well, we may be looking at Benedict Arnold in a totally different way. That monument reads, quote, "In memory of the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army who was desperately wounded on this spot, winning for his countrymen the decisive battle of the American Revolution, and for himself the rank of Major General," end quote. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Love 'em or hate 'em, I hope you now at least have a better understanding of the complicated, conflicted individual who was Benedict Arnold, Connecticut's own, sometimes misunderstood traitor. And my thanks to the Benedict Arnold expert who shared her many insights on him with us today, Regan Miner, Executive Director of the Norwich Historical Society, the city where Benedict Arnold was born. Well, now the answer to this week's trivia question, and the question was, this Connecticut man made one of the most chilling discoveries of the past 250 years. Who was he, and what did he discover? Well, the man was Nathaniel Palmer, lived in Stonington. What did he discover? The continent of Antarctica. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, the story of Nathaniel Palmer. It's very impressive, especially when you consider just how old he was when he made this discovery, and we're going to leave that detail until next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.